Opeth's Deliverance, which is today's album, and it's a pretty short one. It has 6 songs, one of them is an interlude. Unfortunately, all of them are over 10 minutes, except for the interlude, because it's an interlude, obviously. But yes, following the success from Blackwater Park, I was actually super excited to see what they would do next. With, Blackwater Park, they pretty much just found their style and pretty much made one of the best metal albums of all time. Unfortunately, Deliverance is kinda disappointing. I mean, look, don't get me wrong, sure, compared to Blackwater Park, a lot of albums are gonna be disappointing. However, this one really liked a lot of what made Blackwater Park great. One of the things I praise the most about Blackwater Park was the atmosphere and the beautiful mix between death metal and the more like melodic parts, the more let's call it the catchy poppy parts. It's not that, but still, I think it's a good way to separate both of them. One of the things that this album goes for is just being a straight up more death metal album. Don't get me wrong, it's a good one at that, right? However, when you come from the previous one, it feels kind of like a regression, Deliverance still does a lot of the cool riffs, the songs are good, and you do have some atmosphere to it, but that atmosphere that Blackwater Park had, that narrative, through the sounds that the previous album had, this one just doesn't really have them, I mean, look, melodic parts aside, this album does have plenty of really cool riffs and just very heavy ones, right? Despite being only 5 songs long, which is actually really interesting because, as I've mentioned in the beginning, despite being pretty much 5 songs long, I mean, I guess counting the interlude it's 6, this album is actually over an hour long, so it's a proper album, it's not an EP. The songs are incredibly long and they feel like marathons because, look, usually while I enjoy long songs, a lot of these do feel like a drag. Maybe because, again, you don't have that, many ambience parts, full of little nice touches that give you sort of a place to rest, right? It's all about going pretty much all the time. I think this album doesn't do as well when it comes to the ambience parts and when it comes to actually just building this cohesion between both of them, because it's usually the thing that I actually praised a lot Blackwater Park for as well. It's that cohesion between the heavy parts and the melodic parts. This album kind of struggles a little bit with that, especially because you just don't really have that many melodic parts. Another thing that Blackwater Park did really well is that while a lot of the songs there are long, sure, but they're very diverse in sound and they know just when to end, which is, despite having 5 songs, a lot of them do feel like, a slog to go through because a lot of them really don't know where to end. It feels like when a song should end, it just sort of keeps going, And look, I know, I shouldn't be comparing the albums so much, which album should stand on their own. However, at the same time, music does not exist in a vacuum, so it's very important to understand artists' earlier work, to understand where they fit and where their music is evolving towards and everything. So in that regard, I do need to compare this album to the previous one, and to all of the previous ones for that matter. And in that regard, I do think it was kind of a step backwards. And to spoil things a little bit, the ambience, or I guess the non-death metal parts were pretty much mostly cut and put into the next album called Damnation, which ended up having its own positive twist in the band and everything, but that's a story for another day. Either way, as much of a disappointment as this album was for me, don't get it twisted, right? As I've mentioned multiple times by now, this album is still really good, and that just really goes to show how good the previous album also was. And, to be fair, the album does have melodic moments and ambience moments. They just don't really hit as hard and aren't as common as the previous albums, which again, it's a shame because when they do show up, they do enhance the song. They give you that time to breathe, it's sort of that vibe of if everything is heavy all the time, at some point nothing really sounds that heavy, and that's why you need these melodic parts, why you need these ambience parts, to let the listener sort of relax a little bit. So then when the heavier part hits, it's way harder, right? Which is something that Blackwater Park did really well, was we have this heavy riff, and then like sort of everything calms down, and then it just hits you again with another heavy part, and it feels so much stronger because you had that time to rest and to sort of breathe in. Unfortunately, in this album, you really don't have that many moments. I don't think I've been sounding maybe a little bit too negative. It almost feels like the album was actually something completely terrible. And it wasn't, it's just that the bar was actually super high, because on its own, the album is pretty good, especially if you like death metal. A lot of the songs have very cool moments. Deliverance, for instance, has a lot of cool transitions. That was one of the songs that actually did stick out to me. A lot of the other songs do struggle a lot with transitions. This one actually does transitions really fucking well. It almost feels like Deliverance was the transition between Blackwater Park and Deliverance. In terms of how the song is actually composed, it feels much more closer to Blackwater Park in that regard than it does Deliverance, and even has some more like dynamic moments with the singing and everything. It's a good album. It did a lot of like good things, but I would think I would appreciate it way more maybe if Deliverance was released before Blackwater Park, right? So you would have Still Life, Deliverance, and then Blackwater Park, where Blackwater Park would have been like the culmination of all of this work, and then they could have moved on to Damnation and to later albums. Unfortunately, in this thing, or at least in this order, it does make it feel like, as I've mentioned, that they regressed rather than evolved. But again, there's still a lot that I do appreciate about this album. And yes, Deliverance is the best song on the album. I think people's receptions to it compared to the rest really shows that. And something that I actually need to say about Opeth is that it feels like they are sort of stuck in medieval times, like as in like the lyrics they write, the visuals, and the way they like conduct the songs and everything. It all sounds very like Baroque, which I know Baroque is not medieval. I know that those two are completely distinct and very far from each other, but it feels like that sort of thing, right? It feels like there's sort of wealthy aristocrats in the 1800s that just sort of want to be like alternative and make like cool music. I know it's a funny way to describe their music, sure, but I honestly think it's a really good description that actually does fit them, especially this album. I mean, just look at the title of the songs and read the lyrics and you'll see what I mean. And also, A Fair Judgment has these just silent moments. As in like nothing seems to be playing. Maybe my sound was too low or something, because like there were like a minute or two there that nothing was actually playing, and then just sort of it feels like a different song starts altogether. And this is what I mean when I say that a lot of the songs kind of drag, and that they don't actually have those good transitions like Blackwater Park did, because this could have been just two different songs and it would have been, better off for it. Or I guess when I say two, I could even mean 3 or 4 different songs, right? Like it pretty much sounds like sort of they have a song and then they kind of cut it and then they start another song, but it's all in the same song. It's a bit weird. It feels a bit disjointed, I would say. And honestly, the interlude, to me, the interlude is probably like the best part of the album. It pretty much sounds like Patterns in the Ivy, but with a more melancholic tone rather than L+. It was actually really enjoyable, and it was, I think, the song that I enjoyed the most in the album, outside of Deliverance, which is actually really funny, because, again, it's sort of an interlude. Yeah, that's actually funny. Now, before I actually wrap everything up, I don't know what effect they actually used on the vocals, but on the last song, at the beginning, it sounds like a zombie singing. It was a very interesting way of using voice effects in order to give everything a different dynamic, and that's the thing. I think that I need to actually sort of use that as a silver lining, which is as much as I'm like saying that this album is a step backwards and everything, I don't mean that they just did what they did in Blackwater Park and it sounds worse, right? And they just didn't do it as well. They definitely tried a lot of new things, they definitely tried to especially go for a more heavier approach and everything. Like, an attempt to sound interesting, to sound different, definitely was made, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say, hey, you know, like they just tried to copy Blackwater Park but they did it way worse and took out the good parts. Not at all, like they still tried to be very innovative and try different things when it came to the singing, when it came to some of the compositions and everything. It's just that compared to Blackwater Park, they kind of like missed the mark a little bit on that. So, you know, and it's something that they will actually later on pick up with Ghost Reveries, which is an album that, in my opinion, is the true successor to Blackwater Park, where it does what Blackwater Park did well, but it does it differently. Right, it's a different approach to what they did in Blackwater Park, and it's also an album that people fucking love from them for a reason, and one day I will cover that one. But yeah, the album certainly has its moments, you know, be it some good riffs, you know, even more toned down moments, even though they're still pretty heavy, and sometimes it even feels like a lullaby. You know, for instance, while Blackwater Park was more of this, I guess, sort of anger, hopelessness vibe, this album is more, I guess, depressing and sort of melancholic to a point, which helps it actually stand out for the rest of the albums that the band has put out. Look, basically, it's a good album, even if it wasn't what I was expecting, and yes, the album cover is also an absolute killer. I don't know what's up with Opeth having just amazing album covers as well as album names. I mean, who names their album Deliverance? It does obviously sound cool, fucking absolutely, but yeah, it's very interesting. As for my vibe meter, I'm honestly placing it at like 8 out of 10 at the moment. Again, I know I made it sound like this album was really bad, when in reality it was actually really good. It's just not what I was expecting after hearing Blackwater Park, but I mean, that is just a super high bar, and honestly, that just gives that album's score even more weight. But yeah, right now I'm feeling an 8 out of 10, so that's what I'm gonna go with.